Airports look like total chaos. People rushing with bags, boarding calls blaring, planes zigzagging on the runway. It feels like nobody's in charge. But the truth? Every single move is carefully timed. Airports aren't just big buildings with planes. They're like giant control rooms where thousands of tiny decisions have to sync perfectly or the whole system falls apart. Your flight leaving on time isn't luck. It's the result of insane coordination between pilots, ground crews, tower controllers, baggage handlers, even the people driving those little carts you nearly trip over. So instead of chaos, what you're really seeing is one of the most complex operations on Earth. Let's dive into how it all actually works. Pre-flight planning. The story of how your flight works actually starts way before you even show up at the airport. By the time you're printing your boarding pass, there's already a whole team making sure your plane has a place to land, a gate to park at, and a time slot to take off. Think of it like hosting a massive party where every guest shows up with a giant car and wants to park at the exact same time. Airports have to choreograph all of that. Arrivals, departures, and the people in between, without letting the system crash into gridlock. Let's start with arrivals. When a plane is 30 minutes out, the pilot is already chatting with approach control. Their job is like traffic cops in the sky, lining planes up into neat little queues so they don't all try to land at once. Sometimes you'll even feel it. The plane circles around because it's waiting its turn. To passengers, it's annoying. We just want to land. But to controllers, it's like a video game with real stakes. They're keeping every plane separated by just a few miles, making sure no one cuts in line while juggling incoming storms, late departures, and the occasional emergency. Arrivals and turnaround. Once wheels finally touch down, the clock starts ticking. Airports call it turnaround time, and it's the holy grail of efficiency. The plane has to go from full of people and luggage to empty, cleaned, refueled, and reloaded, all in a ridiculously short window. Ground crews move in like a NASCAR pit team. Catering trucks swap out meals, baggage crews unload and reload suitcases, cleaners sprint through the cabin, and someone drives up that long metal bridge so you can actually get off. The faster it happens, the faster the airline can get that plane back in the air making money. And while all that's happening on the ground, up in the tower, controllers are already thinking ahead. The plane you just got off needs a gate, but so does the one landing behind you, and the one after that. It's a constant juggling act where one small delay can ripple out and mess with dozens of flights. Departure planning. Of course, landing is only half the story. Getting a plane back into the air is where the real juggling act begins. Every departure slot at a big airport is like prime real estate. There are only so many takeoff windows available, and airlines fight to grab the ones that work best for their passengers. Ever wondered why your flight sometimes leaves at an oddly specific time, like 3:07 p.m.? That's not random. It's the exact slot the airline managed to secure in the daily schedule. Take New York's JFK, for example. It's one of the busiest airports in the world, with over 60 airlines and hundreds of flights daily. At peak hours, slots are so precious that airlines actually trade them like currency. If Delta wants a better departure time for its London flight, it might swap a less desirable slot with American or JetBlue. It's a giant chess game, and every move is worth millions. Gate management. Once your flight is assigned a time, the gate becomes the next battle. Gates are like parking spots in a very crowded garage, except each car is the size of a building and can't exactly do a three-point turn if something's in the way. At JFK, international flights often need specific gates with customs facilities, which makes the puzzle even trickier. If one flight arrives late and sits at a gate too long, the domino effect begins. The next plane needing that gate has to wait, which then delays the flight after that, and so on. This is why you sometimes hear your pilot say, "We're waiting for a gate to open up." It's not because they forgot about you, it's because the airport is a giant game of Tetris, and one piece is stuck. Boarding and dispatch. Then comes boarding, which airlines treat like an Olympic sport in efficiency. The goal is to get 200 people into their seats as quickly as possible without creating a traffic jam in the aisle. That's why you hear about boarding groups, zones, or even that dreaded basic economy group that boards last. It's not just about fairness, it's strategy. Boarding frequent flyers first makes them feel special, while loading from the back or in certain patterns keeps the flow moving. Every minute shaved off boarding saves money and keeps the plane on schedule. Meanwhile, in the background, dispatchers are double-checking everything from weather conditions to fuel loads. If there's a storm brewing in Chicago, your flight from JFK to Los Angeles might suddenly need extra fuel to circle or even divert. The pilot gets all this info before you ever hear the engines roar to life. By the time you're buckled in and scrolling for Wi-Fi, hundreds of moving parts have already lined up to make sure you actually take off. Taxiing and takeoff. When it's finally time to push back from the gate, things get even more intense. Pilots don't just flip a switch and roll out. They have to ask ground control for permission. Think of ground control as the airport's traffic cops, making sure every plane knows exactly when and where to move. At a major airport, there might be dozens of planes all taxiing at once, some heading to take off, some just landing, and others shuffling between terminals. Without that control, it would look like a giant airliner demolition derby. Once you're creeping along the taxiway, the real waiting game begins. The pilot has to join the queue for takeoff, and that line can get long, especially during rush hours. At busy airports like Atlanta, the world's busiest, it's not unusual to see 10 or 15 jets lined up nose to tail, engines humming, all waiting for their turn to blast off. Controllers in the tower act like DJs mixing tracks, sequencing departures so that a giant Airbus A380 doesn't slow down a little regional jet, or so two planes don't try to lift off in the same airspace. And just when you think it's simple, plane A, then plane B, then plane C, weather throws a wrench into it. A sudden thunderstorm near the airport can close entire runways. Strong winds might force departures to switch directions. Even something as small as a bird strike can stop everything while crews check the runway. To passengers, it feels like endless delays, but from the control tower's perspective, it's a high-stakes puzzle where safety always wins over speed. Finally, when clearance comes through, cleared for takeoff, that's the moment the whole system has been building toward. The engines roar, the runway rushes by, and you're in the air. For passengers, it feels like magic. For the controllers and airport staff, it's just one more piece sliding perfectly into place in an operation that never stops. Airborne coordination. What most travelers never see is that airports don't just manage what's on the ground. They're also playing a long game in the air. Every takeoff and landing you see was planned weeks, sometimes months, in advance through something called slot allocation. A slot is basically a golden ticket. It's the exact time an airline is allowed to land or take off at a specific airport. At big international hubs like Heathrow in London, slots are so scarce they're treated like diamonds. Airlines literally buy and sell them for millions of dollars. Back in 2016, one pair of takeoff and landing slots at Heathrow sold for around $75 million. That's how valuable timing is. But even with slots, airports still have to shuffle things constantly. If there's a snowstorm in Chicago, flights backing up there will ripple into New York, Miami, even Los Angeles. Air traffic isn't just about one city, it's an interconnected web. That's why you'll sometimes hear your pilot say, "We're waiting for traffic flow management from the FAA." Translation: another city sneezed, and now your flight caught a cold. Inside the airport, there's a whole team of schedulers and dispatchers tracking these chain reactions. They're the ones deciding if your plane can push back now or if it needs to wait 15 minutes so the runway doesn't clog up. To passengers, a 15-minute delay feels annoying. To an airport, that 15 minutes can be the difference between smooth sailing or hours of chaos later. And then there's the international handshake. Airports in different countries have to coordinate constantly because planes don't just stop at borders. A flight from New York to Paris might rely on agreements between the FAA in the US and Eurocontrol in Europe to make sure the flight path is clear. Think of it as two giant orchestras on opposite sides of the Atlantic trying to stay in perfect rhythm so nobody crashes the beat. So while you're sipping coffee at the gate and scrolling Instagram, somewhere behind the scenes, a dozen people are already negotiating where your plane fits into this massive jigsaw puzzle. You don't see it, but without it, flying would be absolute chaos. In-flight coordination. Once the wheels leave the ground, it feels like the hard part is over. But honestly, that's when the coordination game gets even trickier. The instant your plane climbs into the sky, the pilot is handed off from the tower you just left behind to a bigger player, air traffic control centers. These aren't sitting at the airport. They're scattered across entire regions, covering thousands of miles of airspace. In the US, there are 22 of them, each one responsible for a massive chunk of the sky. It's like tag teaming a baton race. One controller hands you off to the next as your plane zips along at 550 miles an hour. And this handoff keeps happening. On a flight from New York to Los Angeles, your pilot will talk to a string of different controllers, each one guiding the plane through their section of airspace. Cross into another state? New controller. Cross an ocean? Whole new team, sometimes even a new system. For example, when a jet leaves U.S. airspace over the Atlantic, responsibility shifts to oceanic controllers, who use satellites and radio check-ins to keep track since radar coverage doesn't stretch across the entire ocean. That's why flights give regular position reports. It's basically the pilot saying, "Yep, still here, still on track." Flight safety and spacing. Of course, the big challenge is keeping planes apart. At 35,000 feet, there are thousands of aircraft up there at the same time, all moving fast, and none of them have brakes. Controllers use exact spacing rules, 5 miles apart horizontally and about 1,000 feet vertically, to make sure there's no risk of close calls. And when storms pop up, things get even hairier. You can't just plow through thunderstorms at cruising altitude, so controllers reroute entire streams of planes around bad weather, kind of like redirecting traffic off a flooded highway. To passengers, it looks like the captain just turned left. In reality, that turn was a carefully coordinated move involving multiple controllers, dozens of other planes, and a whole lot of math. It's the invisible choreography that makes flying possible, and most of us never even realize it's happening. Approach and landing. By the time the captain announces, "We've begun our descent," you might think the flight is basically over. But for the crew and controllers, this is crunch time. The approach and landing phase is where the skies get crowded, the decisions get faster, and the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. Think about it. Dozens of flights are arriving into a big hub like Atlanta or Dubai at nearly the same time. They can't all just show up and land whenever they feel like it. Someone has to play traffic cop. That's where approach controllers come in. They're the ones lining up planes like cars waiting at a busy toll booth, giving each jet its turn to land. To passengers, that graceful curve your plane makes before lining up with the runway might feel smooth. But in reality, it's part of a carefully timed ballet where every move is calculated to avoid overlap. Planes have to be sequenced miles apart, with just enough spacing for safety, but not so much that runways sit unused. Controllers are constantly adjusting the order, slowing one flight down, speeding another up, stretching the line when weather or congestion demands it. At airports like JFK or Heathrow, this sequencing happens down to the minute, with aircraft stacked in holding patterns above the city like layers of a wedding cake. Taxiing to the gate. And then comes the final stretch. The tower controller takes over as your plane lines up with the runway. This is where timing is everything. One plane has to clear the runway before the next one can touch down, and in peak hours that turnover can be as tight as 90 seconds. If even one jet slows down exiting the runway, the whole chain behind it can be delayed. That's why you'll sometimes feel your plane hit the brakes hard after touchdown. Your pilot is hustling to clear the way for the guy behind you. For passengers, the last 15 minutes might just feel like a slow glide back to Earth. For the people guiding the flight, it's a non-stop puzzle where every second matters. By the time you hear "Welcome to City," Dozens of invisible hands have already worked overtime to make sure you landed safely and on schedule. Touching down isn't the end of the story. The second your plane exits the runway, a whole new team takes over. Now it's ground control's job to get you safely to the gate without turning the taxiways into a giant traffic jam. At major airports, this is no small task. Imagine rush hour. But instead of cars, you've got giant jets that can't exactly slam on the brakes. Controllers direct each plane using precise instructions, weaving arrivals and departures around each other so everyone keeps moving. So next time you're rolling your carry-on through the terminal or staring out the window at the runway, remember, behind every flight is an invisible army of people, technology, and split-second decisions keeping the whole system from falling apart. What about you? Have you ever had one of those long waits on the taxiway or stuck outside the gate? Share your story in the comments. I bet we've all been there.